interested in all things psychology? You are at the right place. Here, we bring exciting and thought-provoking ideas. We travel into our minds and some things out of this world. Welcome to the Psychology Debrief.
Hello and welcome to the Psychology Debrief. I'm your host, Sam Fairlamb, and today we're talking about neurodiversity. I'm joined today by Dr. Jo Bathelt, whose research focuses on children with developmental disorders. And I'm also joined by recently Dr. Louisa Thomas, whose research focuses on individual differences in reward processing and social influence, particularly concerning people living with autism. Louisa also has a personal diagnosis of autism herself, so she will also be providing some of her unique insights into some of the challenges living with autism. Thank you both of you for joining me today. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, very hot, but good.
So I think maybe the easiest way to kind of start this kind of conversation about neurodiversity is just to kind of, this is not my area of expertise whatsoever, so I think I'm pretty limited in my knowledge. So I think probably you're going to be helping me along the way. So what exactly is neurodiversity? What are we exactly talking about here when we use that term?
I don't know who wants to go first. Do you want to go first, Jo? Shall I?
I think you're more qualified.
Okay, so kind of in general, neurodiversity just sort of refers to diversity of people, how different they are. When you kind of come to referring to being neurodiverse, it's sort of that's when it then encompasses different things like autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia, ADHD. So if you're actually neurodiverse, it kind of is basically just different from what's kind of deemed as the norm, or that most people are, basically. So there's some sort of divergence from what is kind of deemed the most common. I'm not going to say normal, because what is normal really, but what is deemed kind of the most common profile, or maybe a neurotypical person is what it's going to be, kind of the most common person. So and kind of the whole neurodivergence kind of perspective comes from, or originates perhaps from, the idea of not looking at difference so much as being a disability, more kind of just divergence in general is looking at it as though it's potentially, not so negative as looking at it as a disability. And it kind of encompasses perhaps the perspective of social disability, or being disabled maybe by the society that we live in. So perhaps the society that we live in is tailored to people that are deemed perhaps to be neurotypical or normal. So any form of divergence that kind of makes it a little bit harder to function, or you function differently in the society that perhaps isn't set up for you, kind of comes into that perspective of being neurodivergent, and kind of behaving and interacting with the world differently to people that are considered to be normal, or perhaps the world is set up more for that kind of person. So I don't know if that helps or makes it a little bit clearer, but it's just kind of encompasses all of the differences that people have in how they interact with the world. And if you're neurodiverse, it essentially just means that your body and your mind are set up in a way that doesn't kind of go with how the world is set up as much.
Sure, and so I kind of get the sense then what we're sort of talking about here is that it's a way in which we can use it as an umbrella term for a variety of different sort of developmental challenges, I suppose. But also, I guess, in a way that we're trying to, with that term, move away from this kind of binary, typical, non-typical, or, you're autistic or not autistic. Is that the kind of case of one of the... I mean,
there is still very much, if you're either autistic or you're not autistic, there's a kind of you're still, either you are or you're not, but it just kind of encompasses the fact that there is kind of variation everywhere, and it kind of not so much normalizes variation, but it kind of just, instead of saying you're wrong because you don't interact with the world in the same way that everybody else does, it kind of just puts that together to say, well, people are different, there are these differences, so we kind of need to realize basically that people are different. It just accounts for the fact that there are differences in people and everything. It kind of moves away from being like, oh, you're different and it's weird. It's kind of like, people are different, so this encompasses all of the ways that perhaps people are different. But when you actually say that you are neurodivergent, you are different from the norm. So in that case, you would either be autistic or not autistic, or have ADHD or not have ADHD. So that's kind of the point where you can be kind of neurotypical and function normally, or you can be, another kind of way that you can be different is to just not function like that. So you either do or you don't, but it kind of encompasses all of that difference. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. It sounds like it's a way in which, you know, we can kind of reduce a level of stigma, I suppose, to some degree about some of these issues. Speaking of, obviously, you mentioned quite a variety of them when you gave that example. You mentioned autism. I think you also mentioned sort of attention deficit and other ones as well. I'm wondering, do we as psychologists necessarily know what's kind of causing these divergences that you describe? I'm assuming we're getting into genetics here, which is where I'm venturing well far from my expertise. Am I right in thinking that it is a genetic issue? And if so, how much do we really know about what's kind of going on genetically in these kind of cases?
I mean, we know kind of a lot about the fact that a lot of these things are heritable. So it is more common to maybe be autistic if somebody in your family is autistic. One of the ones in particular that's really common is dyslexia. I think that's really heritable. So if somebody in your family is dyslexic, you're incredibly also likely to have some sort of reading difficulty. But although we kind of know that these things are heritable and there is a kind of relationship, a familial relationship, we don't necessarily know about the exact gene profiles that cause all of these things, especially seeing as all of these things generally are diagnosed behaviorally, and there are so many things that can contribute towards the same behavioral profile. So although we know it is heritable, no one's really pinned down one exact thing that contributes to that pattern of behavior in every single case. So although we know that it is heritable, we don't know actually about the exact gene profiles that contribute to these different things at the moment. But I don't even know if there will be that happening, because there are so many different ways that you can end up with the same behavioral phenotype.
Sure. So it may not necessarily be just caused by a singular gene, so to speak. It could I guess, arrive in many different respects. Joe, is that your consensus as well, understanding this sort of area?
Yeah, I think there's also an additional aspect of neurodiversity, and that's where we draw the line between what's typical and what's atypical. So with this neurodiversity movement, along with it came this idea of a more dimensional view of psychiatric and psychological disorders as well. So Louisa mentioned that there is high heritability. So if you have someone in your family who has been diagnosed with autism, the chance of you getting a diagnosis is higher, but it's by no way guaranteed. So it's not like these simple disorders where or if your parents both have it, you will have it. And in addition to that, there's something called the broader autism phenotype. So often people in the families will show some of the same characteristics, but do not meet the full criteria for diagnosis of autism. So that suggests that it's not a binary thing. So you either have it or you don't, but it's more a question of degree. And often it's also a question of impairment. So if someone has these characteristics and they have a lot of difficulties, then it might warrant the diagnosis and the sort of support that comes with it. But if they don't experience any difficulties, then they're just being different. But that's fine if they're coping with it and there's no issue in their life. So yeah, so it's this move away from a medical view where you see that these typical people and there's these atypical people, to more of a dimensional thing of we all have characteristics of these disorders to varying degrees, and sometimes they can cause problems.
Sure, and I really like that idea, of that kind of continuum. I think we've seen that in other areas of psychology as well, and in society with sort of gender diversity as well, where we sort of don't necessarily treat things as sort of static and binary, which I think is great. Something that just came to my mind that I just wondered, and maybe this is quite difficult to answer, because obviously it seems to be, where do you draw necessarily the lines when sort of diagnosing and classifying, if we want to go down that sort of route of classifying. But what is the kind of prevalence of sort of neurodiverse individuals? So what is the kind of prevalence of, say, autism or ASD and other types? I don't know whether you know those kind of figures, but I imagine it might be more common than I'm expecting, perhaps.
I'm not sure on exactly the figures anymore. It used to be kind of around, or sort of when I started my PhD and I looked at figures, it was kind of around like 1 in 100 people were autistic. I know that a lot of people do get diagnosed now that wouldn't have done previously. So when I was a kid, it sort of got missed and I kind of just got ignored until I was a lot older, and then I needed help. And people do get diagnosed older and things, and more people are getting diagnosed. So it might be more than that now, but it's still, even 1 in 100 would still be pretty prevalent. That's still quite a lot of people. But yeah, I'm not sure on the exact figures at the moment anymore, but yeah, a lot of people do get diagnosed now that maybe either wouldn't have been previously or they would have been ignored. And then a lot of that is probably to do with the fact that the diagnostic criteria is kind of based around autistic male children as opposed to older women. So we're kind of getting a bit more of an understanding about how autism presents in different people now, so how it might present in people that are assigned female at birth or older people as well, because it's kind of, if it's traditionally viewed as a very developmental condition, there's still a lot of cases, and a lot of groups that I'm in, a lot of people sort of seek diagnosis when they're older and their doctors are telling them that you can't be autistic because it's for kids. So there's still a belief that it's for kids, but it's kind of becoming more widespread now that people are recognizing it in adults. So we're not getting more autistic people, we're just getting more people that are actually having access to a diagnosis, because knowledge of how it presents differently is getting better, which is a good thing. It does mean that the prevalence will go up, but because we're just recognizing it more, which is good.
Sure.
But yeah, it is quite prevalent, to be honest. Yeah.
And obviously you were therefore most likely diagnosed when you were a child with autism. I'm just wondering whether you can give us some sort of personal experiences of the kind of challenges that you sort of, both as a student, but also I know as a teacher, you've also faced some challenges as well.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually get diagnosed until I was 27.
Oh, okay.
So I got diagnosed as an adult, but I had, like, for my entire youth, not been able to work out what was wrong with me, and always felt really different, like I didn't fit in and stuff. So it's always I've always kind of known that there was something not, at the time I was like, there's something wrong with me. But as I got older, I kind of spent so much time going, like, trying to work out what it was, that then I worked that out. But so when I did my undergraduate degree, I didn't realize that I was autistic. So I kind of didn't allow myself maybe enough time to kind of recover from spending a lot of time with people. I didn't sort of give myself the allowances that I actually need. And now I'm kind of open to being like, if I do spend a lot of time with people, or I have to go out, or I have to get the train, I need to allow myself time to rest. So I did have quite a big burnout in the second year of my degree. But it wasn't until I was kind of in the middle of my PhD that I actually got a diagnosis, because it took so long to get one. But yeah, personally, the kind of reason why I ended up getting one in the middle of my degree is because I was, or my PhD rather, is because I was so overloaded, and there were so many things that I was struggling with. And when I'm more overloaded, things like my sensory environment affect me more. So I was having to leave the house more, getting the train, and I was just so frequently being overloaded by things that were going on around me, and kind of realizing how difficult I was finding just life in general, that I sought help. But actually understanding myself and knowing that maybe I do need a little bit more time to prepare for things than most people. If I do have to socialize or do stuff, then I need to rest. Actually getting that diagnosis kind of allowed me to allow myself for the things that I needed, but previously I'd kind of ignored or just tried to be normal. But yeah, that was obviously difficult, hence why I ended up with a diagnosis. But I think for a lot of people that get a diagnosis a lot later, there is kind of what I would kind of describe as a bit of a period of mourning. Like, even though you're happy that you've got the diagnosis, you kind of look back on your life before and you're like, that would have been so much easier if somebody had recognized it earlier, and I wouldn't have spent all that time trying to be normal. It's kind of taken that time to actually realize who you properly are. But yeah, in terms of being a student and teaching, unlike other people, I guess I just need to allow myself more time to prepare for things. I think in that talk that I did before, I was chatting about kind of going over and actually talking over all the different ways that I could say stuff. So I had like prepared words in my head instead of having to answer things on the spot, because sometimes that's difficult to do. My brain doesn't always work like straight away. So I had to really prepare myself. I actually realized, so the first time I taught, it was terrifying. I went into the classroom and I was absolutely terrified. I realized that I actually really enjoyed being in front of a class, because there's like a very defined rule about how the social interaction goes down. Like, I'm teaching you, you're listening to me, I'm giving you the activities. That kind of, I actually really like that more so than just interacting with people in groups, which I kind of was scared of teaching because it was like, oh my God, people, scary. But actually, I really enjoyed it, even though it took me maybe a lot more preparation than other people, and I need a bit more time to recover it from it than other people do. But I really enjoyed it. It just takes a lot more preparation. But yeah, sorry, that was a very long answer. That was a lot more personal than just teaching and being a student. But there we go.
Absolutely not. I mean, I think it was something that came to my mind was that, you know, often as a teacher myself, I think sometimes you kind of forget how diverse the kind of student cohort you teach is. And, you know, often, you know, because I think most of the time we go about our daily lives just assuming that other people are like us, right? So you kind of forget sometimes as to, you know, you mentioned about not really being able to answer on the spot, whereas, you know, sometimes that I might not realize perhaps as a teacher, you know, if I put a student on the spot, that, you know, it could be that there are a variety of reasons as to why that's very difficult for them. And I think it's often something that, not just in an education setting, but obviously just generally in society, we need to be more aware of. So I think kind of personal experiences like that are really useful, just to kind of raise the salience of an issue, which is great. I don't know if there's anything else, maybe Joe might know as well, anything else maybe in a kind of educational setting where sort of neurodiverse people sort of really have sort of difficulty with, you know, I'm thinking maybe in terms of sort of lectures, is there something particular that might be something that, you know, people need to be more aware of, you know, for example, as me as a teacher, that I could take away and be like, oh, okay, you know, I should be trying to be more aware of that. We're trying to adapt my teaching to be more inclusive, for example.
Yeah, I think there's more awareness coming in now that people recognize that there is this neurodiversity and different people have different needs. I think one thing that we should keep in mind is that even though it's great that we're more aware of these things, we shouldn't assume that we know everything about a person just because we might know what their diagnosis is like. So we should look beyond that diagnosis and really talk to people and see what their individual needs are, not just make assumptions. So there's this famous quote saying, if you met a person with autism, you met one person with autism. That's because how it plays out in their lives is very different for different people, and they're faced with different challenges. It's not just for autism, it could also be for ADHD. One person might have more problems focusing and their mind drifts off, versus another person finds it difficult to sit still for a long time. So it can be quite different how these disorders manifest themselves, or how people behave differently depending on their own background and experiences. So yeah, just keep things in mind, but don't make assumptions about people without talking to them first.
Yeah, and I guess in ways it's kind of like sometimes labels can be useful for us to raise awareness of issues, but at the same time, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, really, where if you end up relying on that label, it's like a stereotype, isn't it? You know, you rely on this heuristic that represents, you know, a broad category of individuals, and then you can, as you kind of mentioned, start making assumptions about people, although their lived experiences under that, you know, say diagnosis can be very, very different. So, you know, for example, Louisa might have had very, very different experiences to other people who have been diagnosed with autism. So I think that's a really good point. Joe, just to talk a little bit more about the research that you do, I'm just sort of wondering, you know, this neurodiversity issue, does it have kind of implications for how we, you know, we talked a little bit about how we might teach, but also about how do we conduct science? What kind of implications does it have in that kind of arena?
Yeah, there are quite a lot of implications, and they're only beginning to be felt, I think. So the classic approach in psychology and psychiatry research is this medical model that we compare typical people to atypical people in order to find some deficit that we can then cure to make them normal. And as you see from this description, this is at complete odds with that neurodiversity movement. So I think for research, we're now moving away a bit more from finding these core deficits, also because that's not a very fruitful approach. So after 50 plus years of research in autism, we haven't nailed down the single core deficit that characterizes autism. So maybe we shouldn't be focusing on finding this one cause, but focusing more on the accompanying things that might make life more difficult for people with autism or with other disorders. So for example, there's now more collaboration between people with that experience and researchers to identify the questions that really matter for their community. One example might be sensory oversensitivity. So that can be a real issue for autistic people, that they get overloaded easily by noisy environments, by bright lights and so forth. And they expressed in some of these collaborative projects that they're interested in finding out why that happens and how they can deal with that. So this is somewhere where research can come in to answer a question that actually matters to their community rather than stigmatizing them by finding a core deficit that makes them different.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of kind of flipping the question really of what we should be asking in terms of science, not looking at the core deficit, but how we can sort of help these individuals with some of the challenges they're having. So I think that's a really good example, you know, regarding what as psychologists we could be doing. Finally, also, Louisa, I know that obviously your research concerns the social influences and also, you know, how, you know, we form beliefs about the environment. Now, my understanding is, I think, to some degree, people who are neurodiverse, so for example, autism, make slightly different or form different beliefs about the environment. Is that the case?
Yeah, so this is kind of what I did in my PhD. A lot of research about something called the predictive coding hypothesis sort of says that we kind of form accurate or potentially inaccurate like predictions about what's going to go on in the environment. And a lot of research that's explored that in autism has found differences in kind of how precise autistic people are at forming beliefs about the world. So some autistic people might have really precise beliefs about what's going to happen. So when things maybe are a little bit unexpected, which a lot of autistic people have kind of difficulties or with processing change and things being a bit unexpected, if it's completely different to what you've predicted, when you've predicted that something's going to be really precise and accurate, if it's different, it kind of can come as a bit more of a shock perhaps. So that might be kind of something that is related to why there are differences in sensory processing in autism. So some people might form those beliefs about the world a little bit differently, or maybe they might be less precise in some people. So there might be kind of under reactivity to some senses as well. If things are kind of, if the sort of predictions are a lot wider, people might react more weakly or more strongly to different things. So that is something maybe that could be incorporated into why there are differences in sensory processing or various other things, predictions about what's going to go on in the world. So some of my research during my PhD did kind of look at that idea of maybe predictions about external information being a little bit different. And we thought perhaps that differences in how autistic people are able to predict potentially the beliefs of other people might change how they're influenced by other people. It didn't, but it was still kind of based around that hypothesis of having different predictions about what goes on in the world. So that's one interesting avenue of research that a lot of people are looking into. I'm researching actually sensory processing still now in my postdoc as well. So I'm kind of extending, thinking about, or still researching autism, but now working at Reading, looking at sensory processing as well, because it is one of the things that so many autistic people identify as being an important thing to look at. So yeah, but predictive coding could be a reason why there are differences in that. So we're kind of, a lot of the research now is kind of trying to focus on things that are actually important to autistic people to kind of see why those things might be, instead of, as Joe said, looking at the very sort of deficit versus not deficit model. But yeah, if there's differences in how strongly people are able, or like how precise people's beliefs are, that might contribute to differences in sort of the strength of sensory differences that people have. So that is one thing that people are exploring, which is very interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I think this has been a fascinating kind of whistle-stop tour into neurodiversity. You know, someone who's, this is not my research area, it's been really interesting. I mean, obviously we haven't been able to explore it in, you know, we've really kind of focused a lot on autism and not, you know, the full sort of area, but I appreciate obviously your guys' research leans more towards understanding autism itself. Just very finally, I guess final thoughts. I don't know whether there's anything else you want to add, or maybe, you know, what's the kind of key take-home thing that you think someone like myself should sort of take away from this? I don't know if there's anything else you want to end on.
Not sure maybe about things that we want to end on, but maybe that's sort of like a small point of clarification. So the neurodiversity movement does kind of account for the fact that all people are different. There might be some traits of things within the population. A lot of people kind of interpret the neurodiversity thing as quite literally meaning that everybody maybe is a little bit autistic, or maybe everybody is a little bit ADHD. But the kind of, when we're speaking earlier about where to draw the line, it's like people that do get diagnosis, or I mean, self-diagnosis is quite valid as well, because people understand how they work. But there is still a difference in actually having just some traits and not actually being autistic. So there is the broader autism phenotype. It's still not actually being autistic. It can be, for some people that are autistic, it can be quite damaging and perhaps invalidating for people to just say, well, everyone's a little bit autistic. And that's something that autistic people get quite a lot. And sometimes the neurodiversity movement does make people think that a little bit more. When they hear it, they're like, well, that means that everybody's a little bit autistic, or everyone has this, everyone has traits of something. There is kind of that line where if it affects your functioning, or you function differently, that's when you would then you're actually autistic, or you actually have ADHD or something. So there is still a line, but it does kind of open the fact that there are traits within the population, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is a little bit autistic, or everybody's a little bit ADHD or neurodivergent or dyslexic or whatever. So I just thought I'd finish on that, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I think it's great to clarify those things. And Joe, final thought, final idea, take home point?
Yeah, I agree completely with Louisa that there is this problem that things might be a bit trivialized or worn down because they enter the general vocabulary a bit more, and we use it in inappropriate contexts. So I think, like with anything, it's important to be a bit aware of the words that we use and what we use them for. So it can be quite a slippery slope if we start talking about, well, I'm a bit OCD because I like things very neat. Then we're trivializing or stigmatizing. Well, we're trivializing a disorder that can massively disrupt people's lives. And we're also stigmatizing it a little bit because we're associated with sort of negative traits. So we should be careful of how we use these words, and recognize people's difficulties if they have them. But be careful with how we use words around mental health and possible disorders or conditions.
Yeah, actually, it's a really interesting point, because I was on a course about mental health earlier last week, and somebody raised a similar point about anxiety, where the term anxiety has become so commonplace that, they sort of remarked that they felt that it kind of trivializes the disorder when we all talk about feeling anxiety and anxiousness. It kind of dilutes the problem. So I think that's a really, really a good point to kind of finish on, that, we should be careful not to trivialize, these issues, which are, really important to try and support those with the challenges that they can face. So thank you both very, very much for taking part. We do have a little bit of time left for a quiz if you want to take part. This is where I get to kind of turn the tide of where I feel like an idiot for half an hour whilst you have all the knowledge, and now finally I have all the knowledge. So if you don't mind indulging me for a few minutes, I've got a short quiz on whether you think these studies replicated. So I went into, I'm presuming you know what the Many Labs project is. So it's the sort of numerous labs across the world combining together to look at whether we can replicate psychological findings. And in Many Labs 2, they looked at, I think, about 27 published studies, and they tried to faithfully replicate the procedure to see whether those effects would replicate. And they used very, very large samples, which, although it doesn't necessarily mean that if it didn't replicate means that the effect wasn't true, it could be many other reasons. It may suggest that there, and is one of the reasons why, for example, we talk about a reliability crisis in psychology. So I've selected 3 studies at random. I don't necessarily expect you to know the answer, and nor do I necessarily expect you to know the underlying psychology. I think some of these I vaguely can understand psychologically, maybe you might as well, but we'll see. So the first one is called Structure Promotes Goal Pursuit. So in the original experiment, 67 participants, they had to generate what they felt was an important goal to themselves. And then they were in one of 2 scenarios where they read about natural events. And in one scenario, they read about natural events that were essentially structured. So they were told, for example, that leaves growing on trees, they produce leaves in a very orderly pattern. So there's a systematic way in which the leaves grow. In the other unstructured condition, they were sort of told that basically things were random. So the production of leaves on a tree is just, it just grows wherever it wants to grow. They then basically were asked to measure their willingness to pursue that goal that was important to themselves. Now, in the original experiment, the structured environment, so reading about, life not being random, life being structured, increased people's goal pursuit. Now, do you think in the replication that replicated? And also, if you do or don't think it replicated, then what is your reasoning?
Oh, this is a difficult one. So it sounds a bit like it's related to priming, and I think priming experiments have a really bad rep for replications. So for that reason, I would think that it does not replicate.
Louisa, what do you think?
Yeah, now that Joe said, I was going to say I think it would replicate, but now that Joe said that about priming, I am also unsure. But I'm going to say that it will. It seems like a relatively straightforward experiment. Like there's not too many things that might change how it goes. They've just kind of asked very straightforward questions and maybe given quite a simple example of structure versus non-structure. I'm going to say it would replicate, because if somebody replicated it, they could quite easily do exactly the same thing that the other researchers have done, because it seems quite straightforward. But I am now worried about the priming aspect of it.
So I'll reveal that Joe was in fact correct, that it did not replicate. Now, I'm vaguely familiar with this sort of research area. It's sort of loosely related to my own. So it kind of derives from theoretical viewpoints about essentially our need to feel that life is structured and meaningful, etc. So the general principle behind the manipulation was to essentially prime, as Joe was saying, it's a priming study, prime this sense that life is structured and meaningful, which should promote goal pursuit, whereas in the other version, life seeming random, chaotic, and therefore meaninglessness, therefore should undermine people's pursuit of goals in life, because what's the point essentially of doing so? So yeah, it didn't replicate, although that being said, I think it's important to note that there's actually a litany of studies that are quite similar to this and maybe larger samples. So the larger corpus of research would say there may be some validity to it. Now, I suspect that maybe if we had some sort of individual difference measure here, that might improve the quality of the findings. Because, for example, one thing that I'm aware of is sort of personality styles like need for closure, where people really need very structured, black and white views of reality. Openness, again, is a similar kind of personality construct. People differ in the extent to which they can tolerate ambiguity, essentially. So I would suspect that maybe if they did it again with some sort of moderator like intolerance of uncertainty or personal need for structure and so forth, they might clarify that effect. Okay, the next one is called effect of framing on decision making. So in this case, it was 181 participants were told to consider a scenario where they were buying an item. Half the participants were told they were buying a $15 item, and the other half were told they were buying a $125 item. Now, both groups were informed that they could travel to a different shop 20 minutes away to purchase that item for $5 less. So essentially, in both conditions, they would save $5 by traveling 20 minutes away. But in the original experiment, those who purchased the $15 item, they were more likely to go to the other branch than in comparison to those who were going for the costly item. So although it would be the same amount of money saved, the general principle was because it would be about 33% off in one condition versus the other condition being, my brain won't work fast enough to figure out that percentage, but very small. So it was 68% said they would go to the other store to save $5 when it was a $15 item, whereas only 29% would go to the other store when it was a $125 item. Now, do you think that replicated?
I would say no.
Okay.
But it depends what samples they've collected it in as well. You didn't mention what sample the first one was, but I don't, depending on who you collected the data from, I think people maybe would care more about £5 if they're students or like lower socioeconomic status or something. So I don't think it would necessarily replicate in every single sample that was tested. So it depends what the replication sample was, but I would be inclined to think possibly not.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have that to hand, but I would agree with you. I'm incredibly cheap, so I would probably go and save the £5 either way.
Yep, same.
So, what about yourself? Would you save the £5 either way, or do you think the hypothesis replicated?
Well, I would definitely try to save the money as well, but I think this reminds me a bit of the Weber-Fechner law from psychophysics, that the proportion of change is what makes differences noticeable. So the money off for the lower priced item is more palpable, feels bigger than for the more expensive item. That seems to be quite a fundamental thing about human perception than probably decision making. So I would think that it replicates.
This is supposed to be a quiz where you have no knowledge about things, so I can show you up, etc. Bringing knowledge to this table is not allowed in this quiz, but Joe, you are correct, it did replicate. And I think you accurately, I think, articulated the reasoning why the hypothesis might stand. That being said, the effect size was half as small as the original.
Oh, okay.
So in real world terms, it means that the magnitude of the effect is not as tremendous as originally thought. Okay.
I guess the reason for that I was just butting in. I was going to say, I guess the reason for that replicating is why the older you get, the shorter each year feels, because in comparison to all the other years of your life,
it's
good, so small.
Yeah, I was going to say that does sound like a very good extension of that hypothesis. Certainly, as I get older, years seem to go by faster and so forth. Okay, the final experiment is called Moral Violations and Desire for Cleansing. So in this study, they explored whether moral violations can induce a desire for cleansing. So participants were primed with moral violations by handwriting an account of an ethical act. So they had to write about a time where a co-worker had helped somebody else, or an unethical act, in which case the condition was that sabotaging a co-worker. So another co-worker sabotaged another one. They then rated the desirability for 5 cleaning products. And what they found was that the unethical account increased people's desire of the cleansing products. Do you think that replicated? Now, I have a feeling, because I said the word priming, that Joe's already decided in his mind where this is going.
Yeah.
Well, I actually do think that this might replicate. And I came across some similar research in the context of evolutionary psychology, where they say that there's a fundamental link between sort of digestion and the feeling of nausea and violations of moral acts. So, well, it also doesn't have a great reputation for being replicable, evolutionary psychology. But yeah, I still think maybe because of a recency effect from reading it fairly recently, that this does replicate.
Okay. So Joe's gone.
I would say it didn't replicate, to be honest, because mainly because of the priming thing, and also just seems really odd that it happened in the first place anyway, maybe, to me. I don't think it would replicate, but I don't know exactly what my reasoning is. I just have a hunch that it wouldn't, perhaps.
Yeah, I think Joe,
I haven't done very well so far.
Yeah, it seems on face value one of those experiments which seems really wacky, where you're like, so you read about an unethical account and then you want to buy cleaning products. But I think that Joe's kind of right with the underlying hypothesis being some sort of evolutionary basis. There are, anecdotal examples from history where people, ethnic cleansing is I think the real example that they're kind of getting at, is this desire when people feel that morals are violated by, say, perceived outcomes. It increases people's desire for cleansing. The answer to the question is that it again did not replicate. So in this case, Joe, you were unfortunate not to go with your original opinion, which priming leads to questionable replication. And it seems to be, in this case, at least with these 2 experiments, and I think there are other examples as well as literature, that priming has caused problems in the past. And I think it's one of those things that I do a lot of priming experiments, is trying to figure out precisely, why sometimes it does and doesn't. And I think, as I mentioned in the previous example, I think one of them is certainly that it's not as monolithic as just sort of saying that you can prime large swathes of people and everyone reacts in a similar manner. It's likely people react in divergent ways, as well as necessarily the potency of the prime and so forth. So there we are. I think in the end that ended 2-2. I don't have a tiebreaker, so I guess you're both.
Well, only 3. There were 3 questions.
Oh,
Joe won.
Oh, sorry. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, in which case you still win because I can't count. So, you know, basically, although this was a quiz that I was never supposed to lose on, I lost. So there we are. Anyway, thanks very much for joining, and also thanks very much for taking part in the quiz. I hope to have you guys on the show again soon.
Thank you.
No problem.
That was really fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you for watching the Psychology Debrief. If you have any suggestions for new topics, quizzes, or any other content psychology related, feel free to get in touch via email or Twitter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye!